Today's occurrence happened in London, England, and sounds almost whimsical on the surface, but like another strange flood I've covered, is actually the complete opposite. George Crick was a storehouse clerk at Mew & Company's Horseshoe Brewery, and going through the usual motions of his shift. It was around 4:30 p.m. when he inspected a fermentation tank that he noticed was missing one of its iron hoops. The hoop slipped off the cask, but it wasn't necessarily concerning because it happened up to 3 times a year. In fact, George wasn't the only one who didn't think it was a big deal. When he told his boss about the hoop needing to be replaced, his boss told him that it was fine and no harm would happen just because one ring broke. George's boss asked him to write a letter to another employee at the brewery requesting that the hoop be fixed some other day. What George and his boss didn't know was that waiting even one more hour led to a catastrophic failure that flooded the streets of London with beer in minutes and claimed several lives. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the story of the London beer flood. The Horseshoe Brewery was located in the crowded and impoverished St. Giles Rookery slum. The area was known for its crime, poverty, and vice. It was home to many Irish immigrants and others struggling to get by. The brewery was famous for its porter beer, producing over 100,000 barrels of it every year. Since its founding in 1764, it had grown to be the 5th largest brewery in London. The Horseshoe had gone through multiple owners before landing in the hands of Henry Mew, who was also part owner of another brewery. Henry purchased the Horseshoe in 1809, and the building stood at the corner of Great Russell Street and Tottenham Court Road. London was a hub for brewing in the 19th century. The industry played a huge role in the city's economic and social life. Breweries in the city collectively produced millions of barrels of beer every year. The working class favored dark beer, and with the industry expanding, urban development was influenced by it. Water distribution systems would be established to meet the water needs of breweries. So, with so much demand, in 1810, a 22-foot-high wooden fermentation tank was installed at the Horseshoe. It could hold more than 3,500 barrels of porter ale and was held together by these huge 700-pound iron hoops. And every year, since it had been installed, the hoops would slip off or break several times. I can only assume that every time in the past, they just fixed the ring when they got around to it. But this time, they didn't get that chance. On October 17th, 1814, around 5:30 p.m., about an hour after George noticed that ring, the wooden fermentation tank exploded. George was in another part of the brewery, but he heard the explosion happen in the storeroom. Hot fermenting ale broke the tank into splinters and took out the back wall of the brewery. At the same time, a chain reaction started when the valve of a connecting tank broke off and burst, and caused more tanks to burst. All of the tanks exploding and flooding the storeroom of the brewery quickly pushed into the streets as over 320,000 gallons of beer were released. The alcohol took out anything and everyone in its path, and reports on exactly what happened to the victims from this point on differ, but I'm going to go with what makes the most sense. 14-year-old Eleanor Cooper was in the yard of the Tavistock Arms Bar working as a servant. The bar was owned by Richard Hawes. Richard was in the tap room of the bar, and Eleanor was washing pots in the yard by a large brick wall shared with the brewery. Richard heard a crash when the back of his building caved in and pretty much everything in his cellar was destroyed. Beer flooded his bar and went across the street, and Eleanor disappeared for hours. Richard survived, but Eleanor's remains wouldn't be dug out from under debris for another 3 hours. She was found standing by the water pump. The wall fell on top of her. Part of what made the flood so devastating was that the beer had nowhere to drain. The city streets it happened on didn't have drains, so the 15-foot or 4.5-meter high wave of beer could only really sweep over everything on the surface or flood the cellars of apartments and houses nearby. Anne Seville's 2-year-old son had died the day before. At the time of the beer flood, she was holding an Irish wake for him, in the cellar of her apartment building. There were 4 other people with Anne, trying to provide her comfort from the recent loss of her son. Mary Mulvey and her 3-year-old son Thomas, Elizabeth Smith, and Catherine Butler were all mourning with Anne. All of them drowned in the flood. As beer filled up the cellar, it continued down the street. In one house, 4-year-old Hannah was with her mother and another child, most likely her sibling. They had just set up for tea, and right as they were getting settled in, beer flooded the house and pushed Hannah's mother and the other child outside. Hannah was trapped in the house, and her remains were found later. Her mother and the other child were sent to the hospital in critical condition, but they were able to recover later on. In another house adjacent to the brew house, 3-year-old Sarah Bates had just asked permission to go play in the street. She was either allowed to go outside, and because she didn't survive, or because she wasn't allowed to go outside, she didn't survive. She was the only one who didn't make it in her family. There were 8 fatalities in the London beer flood and dozens more injured, including those working in the brewery. All of the workers inside survived, but many of them were severely injured. Reports and rumors many years later would say that after the floods, hundreds of people ran into the streets, scooping up beer and trying to save it in whatever containers they could use. There was even a rumor that people that couldn't find containers just started drinking it off the street, to the point where there was a 9th victim who died a few days later from alcohol poisoning. But the truth is that after the floods, people were calm, but shocked, and trying to help each other. Anyone in the streets when it happened ran to jump on tables, chairs, and whatever object they could find to get off the ground. Those living in the cellars of buildings scrambled to get out in time or find furniture to stand on in hope that the flood didn't completely fill their area. An American visiting the area would come forward 20 years later and say, quote, "All at once I found myself borne onward with great velocity by a torrent which burst upon me so suddenly as almost to deprive me of breath," end quote. He was rescued once the flood level lowered. Once it was safe for everyone to move searching for anyone in need of help, everyone stayed so quiet to try and hear people needing help. Several of the men working in the brewery had to be rescued from waist-deep beer and be dug up from rubble. The superintendent of the factory and injured employees were taken to the hospital, and they all recovered. Now, because this happened on a Monday afternoon, most of the victims were women and children. Pretty much all of the men and boys of working age were away at their jobs. The flood was devastating for those affected. The area behind the brewery was described as a desolate scene after the most awful and terrific appearance, similar to an earthquake or a fire hitting the area. But because of the demographic harmed by it, not much was done to even attempt to help victims outside of their local community. Popular press at the time did not like the Irish immigrants in the area, which is actually how we know that the rumors about the people going beer crazy were made up later. No newspaper at the time mentioned that happening, and they would have been the first to talk about it had that been the case. Reports did show that watchmen at the brewery let people come look at the destroyed beer tanks and other ruined equipment for a fee. Hundreds of spectators came to check it out. At the same time, the 5 people drowned in the basement attending the wake were given their own wake at the ship public house. Their remains were placed in a nearby yard near their families. The public coming to see the horseshoe also came to see them and donated money to their funerals. There were also donations by spectators to other families. So I believe those affected pretty much turned around and tried to make something out of what happened to them when they knew they wouldn't get help elsewhere. The press's mindset was shared among the public, which is why the company, Mew & Co., was perfectly fine after this. They received a waiver from the British Parliament to excise taxes already paid on the hundreds of thousands of barrels of beer they lost. The inquest that followed the flood showed jurors the scene of the flood, the brewery, and the remains of the victims. George Crick, the guy who noticed the broken ring, talked about what happened from beginning to end, since he was there for all of it. He told them how his brother was one of the men injured in the brewery during the flood. Richard, the owner of the Tavistock Arms, talked about his experience, his loss, and so did many others, including a man named John Cummins, who is a bricklayer by trade and lived in Camden Town. He was the owner of some of the houses in New Street, where most of the people who were killed lived. He went to the area of the beer flood to try and help those who were affected, and he was the one who found the remains of those who didn't survive in the homes that he owned or out in the streets still floating in beer. I believe he was the one who found Hannah's mother and sibling and got them to the hospital. In the end, the jury determined that the 8 victims of the beer flood lost their lives casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. Basically, it was an act of God and not on Mew & Co. And because of that, the company did not have to pay the victims anything. But Mew & Co. did lose $28,000 at the time due to losing the beer, damaging the buildings, and having to replace equipment. That's the equivalent of $701,000 today, or 573,000 pounds. The company did make a private petition to Parliament, though, where they were able to recover about 30% of that back, which saved them from going bankrupt. Now, to just give some background on how something like this happened and why the press and public reacted the way they did towards this demographic, it doesn't justify it, but it explains it. St. Giles evolved into one of the city's most notorious slums, coining the name St. Giles Rookery by the 18th century due to several factors. In the 12th century, initially, St. Giles was a suburban area outside of medieval city walls and had a leper hospital. As London expanded, the area urbanized, drawing in a diverse population needing affordable housing. Over time, the neighborhood's proximity to the city center made it an ideal location for workers and immigrants, leading to increased population in the area. By the 18th and 19th centuries, St. Giles Rookery had a reputation for lawlessness, from criminals to ladies of the night. It was infamous for its overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions, which enabled lawless behavior to the point where the word rookery itself was synonymous with slum housing. Authors would visit the area to tour it because of its terrible reputation. They would leave and have comments about how, quote, theft, whoredom, homicide, and blasphemy were legible in every face, end quote. Another writer described the area as, quote, a corporation of whores, coiners, sweaters, highwaymen, bawds, pickpockets, and housebreakers, in search of opportunities to exercise their villainy, end quote. The people who lived in the area were seen as an attraction to visit, as shown by how people showed up to view the aftermath of the beer flood. They weren't looked at as part of London society. They were seen as separate, like a mob. Law enforcers, the police of that time, treated the rookery like it was its own district. They wouldn't even consider going into the deep maze of tenements and courts without knowing how to get around all of the tight alleys and gateways filled with gangs and criminals of all sorts. The housing in St. Giles was pretty much dilapidated buildings, narrow alleyways, and poorly constructed tenements. Structures were subdivided into cramped, dark rooms to accommodate multiple families, which led to severe overcrowding. Some residents were forced to live in cellars, which is where some of the flood victims lived. The cellars were damp and lacked proper ventilation, which compromised the health of those living there. With all the crime and filth in the area, special houses called cadging houses came about. They were equated with modern Sodom, and thieves, trampers, and other criminals would rent out rooms in the house. They pretty much fueled criminality. Sanitation in St. Giles was practically non-existent. There wasn't a proper sewage system, so waste accumulated in the streets and alleyways, which bred disease. Cesspools were found close to living quarters, which contaminated water sources and led to frequent outbreaks of illness, like cholera and typhus. The unsanitary conditions were partly because of neglect by authorities, but also the lack of effective public health policies. So the combination of overcrowded housing, poor construction, lack of sanitation, and honestly more, I could go on about this place, but it all made St. Giles specifically vulnerable to disasters. And the area's reputation for crime and vice meant that it was overlooked by authorities. Industry-wide, this disaster did cause large wooden tanks to be phased out of being used in the brewing industry. They were replaced with concrete-lined vessels, which was for the best. Using wood to contain a large-scale fermentation process made it only a matter of time before something like this would have happened. Fermentation is the process where yeast converts sugar in the beer mixture into alcohol and carbon dioxide, which creates a lot of gas, which means an increase in pressure inside the tank. It's not a calm, smooth process. It's quite violent. A huge tank holding almost 4,000 barrels of beer, requiring huge iron rings to keep it structurally together. So when one of the rings snapped, it was probably because it was already under a ridiculous amount of strain from the internal pressure, caused by the gas buildup inside and from the weight of the beer. Once the ring broke, like it did several times a year, the wood staves of the tank couldn't hold itself together anymore. It gave way to the pressure inside, and it caused the whole thing to blow up, and that caused the surrounding tanks to give way. The Horseshoe Brewery was back running not too long after, until closing in 1921, over 100 years later, and that was because Mew & Co. moved their production to another brewery that they purchased a few years before and went into liquidation around 40 years after that. Henry himself would actually go on to become very wealthy before he died. Now, during the time when the Horseshoe Brewery was running, there were so many accidents that it was nicknamed the Unlucky Shoe. Multiple reports in newspapers in the years following the beer flood would report all of the accidents happening in the brewery, to the point where people believed it was cursed. In May of 1844, the Examiner reported, quote, "Horrible death. On Friday week, George Smith, a chimney sweeper, was hired to sweep the steam engine flues at Sir H. Mew's brewhouse, Tottenham Court Road. It appears that the boy was often employed there, and that he had finished his work when he was attracted by the motion of the steam engine. It is also in evidence that he ventured to touch a rapidly revolving wheel, when he was of course instantly drawn in and torn limb from limb, his head falling one way and his arms another. Those who know the spot will bear testimony to the precaution taken to prevent anyone from walking heedlessly into the machinery, but the blame rests on those who admitted a lad between 17 and 18 years of age into the premises in violation of the Act of 3rd and 4th of Victoria, Chapter 85." End quote. In October of 1849, the Worcestershire Chronicle reported, quote, "On Saturday morning, weak man named Harvey Thompson, engaged loading a cart of grains at Sir Henry Mew's brewery, Tottenham Court Road, whilst leveling the grains on top of the cart, was suddenly seized in a fit of epilepsy. The workmen above, unaware of the circumstance, continued to shovel out the grains till the man was completely covered. A passer-by, having witnessed his struggles, raised the alarm, and the poor fellow was rescued, but life was extinct." End quote. In March of 1860, the West Middlesex Advertiser and Family Journal reported, quote, "Lamentable accident. A brewer's drayman in the employ of Mew & Co., Tottenham Court Road, was brought to Westminster Hospital on Sunday night, having received a dreadful bruise on the leg. He was riding on the dray with his legs hanging down, as is usual with draymen, when another vehicle came in contact with the dray and crushed the poor man's leg. He has recovered from the accident, though it was found necessary to amputate the leg in the hospital. The careless perpetrator of the deed made his escape, so that up to the present time, nothing further of him is known. The unfortunate man's name was John Caleb, and the accident occurred near Westminster Bridge." End quote. In March of 1861, the North London News reported, quote, "Fatal accident. On Wednesday, Mr. G.S. Brent, Deputy Coroner for West Middlesex, instituted an inquiry in the Middlesex Hospital. The death of Henry Dutfield, aged 36, carman. Appeared that the deceased was unloading quantity of sacks of malt at the brewery of Messrs. Moe, Tottenham Court Road, when several of the sacks suddenly became detached from the chains in the course of being hoisted in the brewery from the wagon, and fell upon him, crushing him in so frightful manner as to break most of his ribs. He was removed to Middlesex Hospital, where he expired in great suffering. A verdict of accidental death was recorded." End quote. In April of 1877, the Tamworth Herald reported, quote, "Fall of a chimney. A tall chimney stack, which was being erected Meters Mew's Brewery, Tottenham Court Road, London, fell shortly before noon on Tuesday, whilst a whole number of men were at work upon it. The injured men were dug out as speedily as possible and taken to the hospital. It was supposed that Monday night's rain had soddened the new brickwork." End quote. And lastly, in October of 1915, the Wells Journal reported, quote, "Fatal beer fumes. a verdict of death by misadventure at Holborn Inquest on Friday, Robert Dickinson, aged 51, a brewer's townsman living in Islington, who was suffocated by fumes carbonic acid gas at the bottom of a vat at Mews Brewery, Tottenham Court Road. For the last fortnight, he had complained pains in the head, which he attributed fumes to vats. On Tuesday, he entered empty vat, which was capable of holding barrels of beer, to remove the plug. Suddenly, he began to shiver and sank to his knees. Another workman at once entered the vat, but could not move Dickinson, who weighed 18 stone, or 252 pounds. He himself was affected by the fumes and was ordered out. When Dickinson was got out with ropes, he was dead. The foreman explained that afterwards it was found that a valve in the vat had been left open, and fresh beer was coming into it when Dickinson entered the vat. That ought not have been so. It was stated that at the bottom of the vat was a quantity of sediment, and that the fresh beer was in an active state of fermentation, throwing off carbonic acid fumes which suffocated Dickinson at a time when he was suffering from heart disease." End quote. Throughout the 19th century, the local government tried to reform St. Giles. Specifically, they displaced residents to make way for New Oxford Street in 1847. The wealthy believed that doing that somehow solved the poverty issue, and were shocked that the people that just lost their homes were now crowding over 1,000 people into one street. Sounds similar to how some cities try to tackle that issue today. Today, the Dominion Theatre stands where the Horseshoe once stood, and the St. Giles Rookery is now where one of the most expensive shopping places in London stands, with New Oxford Street right where they put it all those years ago. The industry learned a lesson from this and eventually made changes to their practices, but missing the rings, repeatedly breaking, was a huge warning. This happened hundreds of years ago, but the lessons from this can be connected to repeated warnings or small things in everyday life that point to larger problems. For example, let's say you have a car, and every single year, that check engine light comes on. You don't get it checked out, you just reset the light or ignore it because the car still runs fine. One day, the car breaks down completely in the worst possible place at the worst possible time it could decide to stop working. Because you ignored a failing engine component repeatedly, it caused a major failure. With respect to the victims, to have a huge 15-foot wave of beer be the reason people lost their lives is the most ridiculous thing. It's right up there with the molasses flood in Boston. That episode will be linked in the show notes since I did it previously, but it's just so nonsensical. Like, I understand it, I get it, but I would have been remiss if I didn't connect these dots, because I know that with disasters like this, it's very easy to see it on the surface for how ridiculous it is. But for the person out there that's listening, and you don't have a faulty fermentation tank or a car that's breaking down, it could be neglecting what you think are minor health issues. It could be ignoring signs of burnout. Addressing the problem early on can prevent much larger consequences later. In the brewery's case, the ring breaking every year was the reddest flag. But since nothing catastrophic happened initially, they didn't connect the dots until disaster struck, and by then, it was too late. Now, it led to industry-wide changes, and rules are written in blood, but as we continue through this year, please apply some of these broader lessons to your daily life. Stop overlooking recurring issues that lead to completely avoidable crises because you're ignoring the root cause. Please stay safe, follow or subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll be back next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.